time to change the tire on my 2005 Honda VTX 1800. I'm How To Bob. Here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to start by jacking the bike up. I have a bike jack. Once I get the wheel off the ground, I'm going to use a 6mm hex socket to loosen up the pinch bolts. There are 4 pinch bolts in the forks, 2 on each fork. So I'll just loosen those up a little bit and I'll leave those in. Go to the other side and loosen the other 2 pinch bolts up. Next, I'm going to use an impact driver with a 22mm socket to take the bolt out of the axle. Don't have to use a impact driver, but it helps. So I get that out. I'm going to use a wooden dowel to drive the axle out all the way. And the axle should be coming out now, so I'll go around to the other side and start pulling it out by hand. Next, I can remove the wooden dowel, and I want to remove one of my brake calipers. You can get away with just removing one side. Don't have to remove both, and I'll use a 12mm socket to remove the caliper bolts. And once I get the caliper bolts off, you can see they're just same size on each bolt is the same size. I'll hang my caliper with a hanger and then jack the bike up high enough so that I can remove the wheel from underneath the fender. Just slowly work it out from between the brake pads, and out it comes. Now, before I replace the tire, I want to take these bushings out. The large one is on the left-hand side. Spin it around, and there's another bushing on this side. It's a smaller one on the right-hand side. So I've got my new tire installed. I've got the bearing area cleaned up. I'm going to add some more wheel bearing grease. Just kind of work it around inside the bearing and the whole area around here. I'll clean that up once I get everything put back together, but I want to add a little bit of extra grease, shoving it into the bearings, and then I can put my bushings on. You can see the difference in the size here. So the smaller one, like I said, goes on the right hand side, and the larger one goes on the left hand side of the bike. So I've got my bushings in, I've got the grease in. It's time to reinstall the wheel. I'll roll it over. Got my bike jacked up pretty high so that the wheel will go underneath the fender. And I'm going to roll it into place and make sure I line up my rotors with my brake pads. They have to go in between the 2 brake pads on both sides. You can see I've got the brake pads going right around the rotor. And once I get both of them lined up, I can lift up on the wheel and have my axle ready on the other side of the bike. And once I get it started, it should tap right in and it'll stop right at the neck. And now there's 2 things that need to be lined up now: the neck on the left-hand side of the bike and the tip of the axle going through the other side of the fork on the right-hand side of the bike. And once you get those lined up, it should tap right in using a rubber mallet. I'm going to put my axle bolt back in, and I'm going to use some Loctite. I always like to use Loctite on brakes or suspension. And I'll snug that down with my 22mm socket. And then I'll torque the axle bolt down to 66 foot-pounds of torque, and I'll need to use a 17mm hex socket to hold the axle on the opposite side while I tighten down my axle bolt. So I just keep cranking this down until I hear the torque wrench click, and there we go. So I can put my caliper bolts back in, and again I'm going to use some Loctite. So I can take my hanger off now and put my caliper bolts in, and the other one gets some Loctite. And I always start the bolts by hand to prevent cross-threading. Once I get them started, I'll come back in with my 12mm socket and snug them down. Once they're snugged down, I'll use my torque wrench and tighten those to 22 foot-pounds of torque. So next I need to tighten my pinch bolts, and those get tightened down to 16 foot-pounds of torque. Do both of them on the right side, go around to the left side, tighten down both of those, and then before we ride we want to check the brakes. Squeeze the brake handle a few times to make sure that it's operational, and that's how you remove and replace the front wheel on a 2005 Honda VTX. I'm How To Bob. Thanks for watching.